morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Welcome to the Exploring the Atlas of Digitized Newspapers and Metadata workshop. We probably will be having a few more people coming in over the course of the next 5 minutes, but hopefully this will be a good place to start so that we can get the full 2 hours to really dive into our conversations. I would like to introduce myself to begin with. My name is Melody Beals. I usually publish or have things online as MH Beals, so that's the same person in case you're wondering. I am a lecturer in digital history at the University of Loughborough. I was one of the initial principal investigators for the Oceanic Exchanges project. The Oceanic Exchanges project, as I mentioned in the introductory video, was a 2-year collaborative project between 6 different nations on historical newspapers. And I was one of the principal investigators for the UK team, as well as the work package leader for the Ontologies program. And I will hand it over to my colleague Emily, who will introduce herself.
So I'm Emily Bell, and I worked with Melody at Loughborough as a research associate on that Ontologies strand, which is what led to the atlas that we've created. And in my background, I'm a literary and a cultural history researcher, so I approached this very much as someone who'd been using collections and knew a little bit about metadata, and then did this deep dive into how these collections work. And then for the last year, I've been looking at ways of creating resources from the atlas and from the work that we did for schools and for other ways for people to get into the collections.
Very briefly, I'm going to elaborate on the videos which we sent you previously. The videos were meant to be sort of a technical or at least semi-technical insight into how we approached the atlas, where it sort of came from. I want to sort of reiterate, the atlas was in no way part of our original remit for the project for Oceanic Exchanges. It was something that really came out of necessity when we were trying to do the actual part of the grant, which was the mapping. So we had intended to map one set of metadata to the other, and we found that we could not do that without the contextual information from a historical and a literary or periodical scholar point of view. We just couldn't make sense of it without that extra context. So we tried to take all of that information that we gathered for personal understanding and package it in a way that would be useful to other people. So we didn't think that the metadata really spoke for itself for any of these collections, and we really wanted to provide individuals sort of a head start to what we had at the beginning of our project. So most of the material in the atlas comes from internal documentation, trial and error, speaking to librarians and digitization specialists, and it's sort of pieced together, which is why it's not completely footnoted. We do have an extended bibliography, but most of the information was pieced together from so many different sources, many of them oral, that we were just trying to put together a narrative that gave the information as easily and most digestibly as possible.
And so what we wanted to do was to put all of that sort of context in one place so other people could use it, whether they were doing research across collections like we were, whether they were thinking about how to sort of apply what we found in terms of questions to ask of other collections, or if they just wanted to use a database that was in a different language than their native language, and they wanted a little bit more of the history or background of that maybe they didn't have access to in a lingua franca such as English.
So I really want to talk about what the atlas is and what it isn't. It is a guide to 10 collections that we used, but it is not a comprehensive look at every digitization program in the world, or necessarily even representative of the majority of projects. The Transatlantic Partnership for Social Sciences and Humanities, who funded us, was specifically looking at transatlantic collaboration. So we did have scholars from North America and Europe working together, and we did very, very gratefully receive some assistance from the National Libraries of Australia and New Zealand sort of after the project began. But we really hope that the atlas will now evolve to include far more projects that are either not national libraries, but state or district libraries, local research projects, and of course big and small libraries in the global south, particularly South America and Africa, and also in Asia, which is not currently represented. So the Atlas project is coming to a conclusion at the end of this month in terms of our initial funding, but I will be continuing it onward as part of my normal lectureship duties. So we are hoping that it will continue to expand and are seeking collaboration and seeking submissions in whatever format they can come to really make it representative of digitized newspapers going forward.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to dive headfirst into our discussion. So the discussion question I really want to start with, and again, please feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak verbally or just to type your messages into the chat window and we'll read those out and kind of discuss those more widely. So based on your experience, whether it is working in a library to develop these collections, whether it's working with hard copy newspapers and only beginning to work in the digital sphere, whether it's somebody who's been working with these collections in a very intense data-centric way, or somebody who is doing their PhD and using digital collections. Considering what you know about digitized newspapers now, what do you think or what do you hope the digitized newspaper environment will look like in 2030, in 10 years from now? And what do you think we need to do as a community of users and providers to sort of get us to that area? So I'll start us off just while you're all thinking and starting to type. There's been a huge movement in digitized newspapers over the past 20 years. When we created our timeline on the Atlas, it was kind of shocking to me how rapidly everything really took place. And I think over the next 10 years, it's going to expand much further, but I think it's also going to have the potentiality of either converging towards a single model of how digitized newspapers are digitized and presented to the world, or it's going to really expand into lots of niche different projects as people have sort of the ability to create their own small digital collections. And personally, I really like the bespoke collections because they can speak to specific audiences, provide specific details and interest. And people are always going to be more passionate about a specific project than they are about a general one. But I really hope that moving forward, we don't splinter so much that the projects become incompatible, because the one thing we learned from oceanic exchanges is that in the 19th century, surely, but even today, these conversations do not happen in isolated groups, however you want to define them. And the more we can cross-connect these collections and connect them with people who are specialists on the sort of paradata surrounding the collections, the richer our understanding is going to be. So I understand the urge for homogeneity and bringing everything together under one standard, but we have to do that in a really thoughtful way. So I'll hand it over to Emily to give her initial views, and then we'll start pulling comments from the group.
So I'd like to preface this by saying that the question itself was a prompt given as a workshop run by Impresso, which is a great project in Luxembourg, which has done a similar thing in trying to make it possible to look at the various different newspapers held by regional libraries there. So they invited us there and made us think about this question. And so I'm looking at I can probably share this actually. The brief slide that I put together for that workshop on the kind of thoughts that I had. And this is very much shaped by my work on oceanic exchanges, where thinking about collections as data, which is a movement, and there's a great report on this and what it means to think of collections as data, essentially means you're thinking about it not just as here's 500,000 newspaper pages, but what is the shape of this collection? How could somebody access and do kind of computational analysis on a whole collection as data? And as people have been mentioning in the chat, there's lots to do with open access that becomes important there. You need to be able to access collections. It's very difficult to get copyright permissions for everything. I think there will be a greater expectation of transparency because of increased public digital literacy. We talk about digital natives now, but I think it's not quite as true as we'd like it to be at the moment, but it's getting more true. As Melody said, increased integration between these collections, hopefully. I think there'll be greater attention to accessibility issues, and I do think that partly comes down to metadata, because if there's information that's just visual, like mastheads on newspapers, it's not particularly accessible just to look at a scan of a newspaper page. So actually improving things like what's recorded in the metadata makes it possible to have an interface or a website or a search function that can do more things in terms of accessibility. And then finally, crowdsourcing is a slightly controversial one. It's a good way of creating new collections and enhancing what you've got, but we found that a lot of providers are quite hesitant about sharing control and giving people the ability to create new tags, to alter transcriptions and things like that. But there are lots of other projects outside of Digitised newspapers that are getting a lot of people on board to transcribe manuscripts and things like that. And so I think in 10 years, there'll be more of that, more expectation that users can be helpful in terms of how these collections become searchable for future users. So those were my original thoughts, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
I really hope that digitized newspapers become much more integrated with the value-added data or the indexing or other things that people outside of the libraries are creating for their own uses. And there'll be some way of feeding that back into the collections, sort of round-tripping the data back. That's my hope for the next 10 years.
So I'm seeing quite a lot in the chat, and I do really want to open it up for voice if anybody wants to, but I'll just talk about a couple of the things that are in the chat first of all. A lot of things that I'm seeing are about open access, and we found that really interesting as we were looking through these collections. Copyright law, for those of you who are not really aware of the history of copyright law, obviously copyright law began in different nations at different times, but the first sort of international Berne Convention to sort of standardize copyright protections across the world or in many countries specifically excluded newspaper content. It was considered, along with scientific journals, ironically. So specifically, newspapers were considered a public good, something that everyone, once it was published, would be accessible. And that exception got more and more constricted as the 20th century progressed until newspapers became just as copyrightable and copyrighted as any other text really are. And that has presented a lot of difficulties. Now, there are a lot of librarians in the group, so I won't speak on your behalf. You're welcome to speak for yourself. But our understanding is that in general, there was a huge desire to make everything available, open access, to make everything available for free. But there were a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of goodwill by some of these publishers in making them at least partially accessible online that needs to be kind of mediated with that. So I wonder if maybe that's a good place to start. Does anyone have any thoughts on how to make things more open access, considering we don't control the legislation and the copyright intellectual property of the world? The other thing that I thought was interesting that was coming up in the chat was the interfaces being more visually friendly. That was something I thought we noticed a lot as well. There were a lot of people who were commenting that there were lots of improvements going on to different interfaces, but that they didn't want to lose things as they were gaining more things. They didn't like things being simplified necessarily. They liked having lots and lots of options. So to June, if you were to add a little bit more to that, is it just about it being aesthetically pleasing or nice to look at, or is it about being navigatable and being able to interact with it in that way?
There's been some interesting points, as you say, about open access, and that there are some collections that are still publicly available. I think you have a story about, is it Finland, where somebody hugged? Do you want to tell that story?
Sure, yeah. So in one of the conference papers in the IFLA conference proceedings, a Finnish librarian says that making the Finnish newspapers open accessible was so popular in Finland that librarians were actually being hugged on the street by people who were using the collections. And I thought that was really lovely because it's something that, I think people find them so valuable and they find them so not just for their work, but just for their sense of community and their sense of family. That I think hugging a librarian, so long as they're okay with it, is a really appropriate response, considering the amount of work that goes into making these collections available.
So there's comment about improved searchability, better quality scans, more user-friendly platforms, and being able to access published layouts as well as just text. So as well as optical character recognition, we've got optical layout recognition, which is sometimes called, but it's not quite the same thing, that does try and capture some elements of the layout, but with newspapers, it's so variable. And I keep sticking on this point that you can't look at mastheads specifically, and mastheads that tell you so much about the political leanings of a newspaper and the audience and all the kinds of things that come up there. You just have to look at a front page. You can't actually compare how they change over time, which might show how audience changes over time or how political affiliation changes. So I agree that the layout would be very useful to be able to actually pinpoint specific things. Torsten says a special issue is small archives that often have relevant local newspapers but no resources for digitization processes. So could institutions who digitize larger collections support such small archives?
That's a really interesting point. So we've spoken with some of the other larger institutions, so the national libraries of various countries. And thank you to Sinai for telling me that I was using the wrong microphone. I hope this is a little bit clearer to listen to. There's a difficulty there in terms of an idea of, I guess, imperialism in a way. A lot of these smaller collections are very specialized. They often have community groups attached to them. And the idea of these big resourced libraries coming in and providing access or providing digitization seems very sensible because that's where the money is. But at the same time, it does create questions of ownership in terms of how the collections are going to be digitized and how the collections are going to be provided and integrated with these other resources. So I think that is something that really needs careful discussion. And I absolutely agree. I would really love for it to be more sharing of resources, especially for smaller institutions. And I think the National Library of New Zealand and the National Library of Australia both provide ways for essentially providing materials and a bit of the cost in order to publish it. Especially the National Library of Australia does provide that. So there are mechanisms available, but it is something that is difficult to navigate just because there's a tension between centralization and the passion in the community that surrounds some of these smaller periodical collections. And I think we'll just take one last round, but I think one comment I saw go by really quickly was the idea of a collaborative index. And I love this idea. I love the idea of a collaborative index. When we spoke to Gail Singage, and I don't know if there's anyone from Gail here, hello, if there is, they talked about the Times digital archive and the fact that there is the Times Index, which is one of the most well-known sort of multi-volume indexes of newspapers. And they didn't think anybody would want a digitized version of it. They thought that, once you had full text searching, that was all that you needed. So I think it's really important that researcher voices get heard, that actually that kind of knowledge creation and knowledge categorization is really important. And I think maybe you meant by index just where are all the newspapers, but that would be the same sort of thing, is that sort of organizational data is really valuable to researchers. So, Emily, is there, and the other thing that was coming up a lot was the idea of easier access to downloads or for mass downloads. And that's something we've definitely noticed a lot of. There are certain of our collections, so the National Library in the Netherlands, for example, where you can phone or email them up and say, this is what I want to do, and they can, put together a collection for you. Um, there are other ones where you can download directly from them in file groups. Um, but this is something I would really love people to put in the chat or to feedback in feedback. What is your use of these newspapers in terms of the web search or the API, if anyone uses APIs to access them, or if the best way really is just, can I please download everything into one giant file onto my computer? Because that was my personal preference as a researcher, and it seemed the weirdest and the most foreign whenever I asked for it. So maybe just how you guys would like to interact with these newspapers, the ones that are freely accessible anyways, and what kind of accessibility you would like and why. I think saying I just want it all on my computer can sound a bit strange unless the reason why is fully explained. First couple that I saw that kind of linked together were about accessibility issues, which is something that hasn't really come up in any of our other workshops yet. So that was really interesting, the idea of audio transcriptions or general better accessibility. And I think that's really, really valuable. There's a lot of concern, I think, with the way images of newspapers are displayed sometimes in Java or Flash viewers. And that's not useful for assistive technologies. It makes it very difficult. And I think most people who interact with it don't find it particularly nice either. They find it restrictive on getting the images they want. They just want to right click and save the image. So I think developing better integration with assistance and making things more accessible would be beneficial to everybody, really. The other main one I'll point to before handing it back is, again, the better idea of what's out there. There's what are other libraries or collections doing? How have they put their stuff together? And that's something we were hoping to get sort of kickstarted with the Atlas. There was a really good sense among librarians that they were constantly copying each other or trying to learn best practice from each other. But that only seemed to be working through serendipitous connections at conferences or going to workshops at each other's libraries. And there wasn't like a central repository for this is what we did and this is how well it worked and this is where it didn't work. And that, I think, is something that would be really helpful going forward, is just some sense of shared conversation.
Absolutely. Some other issues people are bringing up. So Beverly mentioned sustainability, projects disappearing. And that's something that you see a lot with sub-collections, where people put a lot of work into a sub-corpus of newspapers and then it sort of disappears as the funding disappears, and that's a big problem. Lara mentions greater linguistic diversity, so more non-European languages present and tagged in digitized corpora. As we mentioned in the video, metadata itself is often in English, the fields are in English, which I think is possibly a barrier to access for some collections, or it might encourage people to use different standards. Open access to collections to integrate with linked open data. Open access is a big one, I think. And some of the collections we've worked with are fully open access. So Trove, Delphi, the Finnish collection, where Melody has a story about librarians being hugged in the street.
Yeah, I just thought it was lovely that the Finnish librarians, the librarians at the National Library of Finland, because it was such a community-driven project to digitize the newspapers, to provide something back to the community for local identity and local heritage, that actually librarians were recognized on the street and people would come up and hug them and thank them for digitizing their newspapers, which I thought was lovely. And, so long as the librarians are okay with it, something we should consider.
And in terms of integration, Eileen mentions integration with something like the Waterloo Directory, which has circulation figures, political affiliation, which would be very useful. And I'd like to mention again the Impresso project, which is the Luxembourg, it's a kind of Luxembourg aggregator of various newspaper collections. And they do have some things like political affiliation within the metadata, depending on whether the library that they're pulling from has that information. But it's really interesting in terms of these things, because the question then becomes, how do you trace that change over time as the political affiliation changes, as the circulation figures change, even as the title of the newspaper changes? That is in the metadata. The British Library particularly has variant titles recorded quite well, but so many of these things, like political affiliation, do change over time. And how do you capture that in the metadata?
There's a couple notes as well from Megan and from Bob and a couple others, I think, about the level of detail in the metadata. And that's something we really struggled with, because there was a lot of times we assumed that the metadata should provide information on, for example, like Megan says, the particular issue that was scanned. And I thought maybe that metadata was just hidden somewhere, and it's not in any of the databases that we looked at. It's very difficult to figure out, especially when collections were borrowed in order to complete runs. You can't just assume that it's the copy that that library has. There are lots of individual issues that are not individually provenced. So that sort of issue provenance data being metadata would be really helpful. And having clear metadata for the editor, for example, of that particular year or month, because sometimes if it's included in metadata in the MARC or the library catalog record, it's for the publication as a whole. So you just have to hope that that editor was still alive and working when it's being attached to the newspaper you're looking at, or you can't say anything about it.
Oh, that's a good one as well. So Eileen mentions visualizations to allow users to get a quick initial sense of the coverage of collections. Some of them do this. Again, the Impresso project has literally a sort of graph that shows what issues they have and what they're missing. We've got an Impresso person. Oh, sorry, to clarify. So from Maud, she says the political orientation was added manually by the historians of the Impresso team. Sorry for getting that wrong. And it's Swiss Luxembourg, not only Luxembourg. So thank you very much for coming, Maud. I'm going to evangelize the Impresso project. Downloading search results and metadata as manipulable database. So I think that's something you could do with an API, is download some of that. Is that right?
Yeah, so for collections like Trove and for Europeana as well, either now or in the near future, you'll be able to download batch collections of the metadata. You can also do that somewhat with the National Library of New Zealand, but it's not always labeled the same way that it is in the back-end collection. So they have, I was going to say, user-friendly metadata fields in the API. So sometimes it's not always clear what it's referring to and the specificity of that information. So yes, if I could just download just the metadata as it is in its completeness from the backend, I think that is a great suggestion moving forward. There's also a historian in Britain whose name is escaping me at the moment, but she actually went through the 18th century Burnley collection for one of the newspapers and did issue by issue what was digitized, what existed in the library, and whatever existed, to kind of show the difference in date coverage. And it was this really telling graph about the inconsistency about what was actually digitized and what it looked like was digitized based on the date ranges in the collection. So I think visualizations are so helpful, and they're not done enough.
There's been a few comments about persistent links and identifiers, or things like standardized fields so that named entity recognition can be more consistent across collections. And that's, again, something that we've been trying to draw attention to, where the fields are used. And it's quite interesting with a lot of the collections that authors are not often identified. It's not often in the metadata, because unless it's printed on the article, which it wasn't for most articles, particularly in the early 19th century, the fields are just not there. So some of the collections had author where there was a pseudonym or a pen name, but most of them did not, because there just wasn't the data for that. So that, again, requires a lot of input from something like the Waterloo Directory, which has been doing that very well, but it's just not there in the metadata at the moment.
And I think I'd like to add one thing about the diversity of newspapers that have been digitized, especially for non-English language or non not the language of the main archive that's holding the newspapers. One of the difficulties we found talking to libraries is that sometimes the non-main language newspapers were donated as particular collections by individuals, and they have different rights and curatorships attached to them. So the libraries don't often have the remit or the permissions to go ahead and digitize that as part of their normal digitization program. And in some places, there's also been cultural sensitivities about it as well, where they're concerned that a dominant culture going in and taking a smaller culture's periodical material and digitizing it will be seen as colonial or imperialistic, and therefore they're very hesitant to do that without a lot of vocal support from the communities that they're digitizing. So this is something that I think if minority language or minority culture groups are keen to have their newspapers digitized, to make that clear to the librarians that yes, please, this is not seen as a colonial act, that we actually do want this to happen, or to work with the libraries directly to make sure it doesn't go down any weird avenues. But that is something that came up in multiple institutions, this concern about cultural appropriation or digitizing things that had been, in the case of a couple places, obtained through what would now no longer be considered ethical practices, things that had been inherited by the libraries from 19th century predecessors. What I would like to say is that this initial plenary session was just to get you thinking and get some ideas of different topics that you might want to discuss more in the heart of this workshop. And the heart of this workshop is going to be the what is affectionately referred to at the Software Sustainability Institute as speed blogging.